There's always a risk if you're third on a panel that you end up saying what everyone else has said. So let me merely say in beginning that I of course, supports what both Ian and Nicola have said, not least the notion that universities will be pivotal to economic well-being, social well-being in the 21st century. I just take that as a given. And I've taken a slightly different approach to the exam question. So the exam question was, just remind myself, strategic challenges for university leaders in a more contested global and national space. So I conducted a kind of simple thought experiment. So imagine that on September the 30th, I stand down as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Nottingham, and I will. But imagine today I'm offered a job as Vice-Chancellor of another university. And because this has been recorded, and some of you may know my wife, A, I have not, and B, if it were offered, I would not be accepting. But imagine that were the case. So what would I be looking at in this institution in thinking about its prospects for succeeding in the 21st century? What were the 3 or 4 big things I'd be thinking about? I'll assume it's a university a bit like Nottingham in the sense that it's large, it's comprehensive, it's research intensive, it's got a civic commitment. I won't introduce the complication of international campuses. But in that kind of context, I think I'd be thinking about 4 things. 3 which would be kind of institution specific, and then 1 which is a much more general one. It's a challenge for all of us, and it's one that both Ian and Nicola and indeed Laurie in his opening remarks touched on. And those things, those 4 things would be: first, resources and sustainability; second, digital transformation and the core business in inverted commas; third, the future of globalization; and fourth, public perceptions and public goods. So let me just say a few words about each. Resources and sustainability, you might say, well, that's core business. You should always, as a university leader, be worried about resource and sustainability. And of course, for business as usual, that's our day job. And even business as usual in the kind of organizations that we lead as research-intensive universities, you need, year on year, additional resources just to stand still. But that's business planning. If you want to grow and prosper, you need additional resources. So where in the current climate are those resources going to come from? So one of the first things I'd look at in this university that's just offered me a job is what the prospects are for revenue diversification. Because I'm going to assume that public finances will be constrained, will be no less constrained than they are at the moment. So what are the prospects for revenue diversification? Is this an institution that has a history, a culture of building philanthropic partnerships, promoting advancement more generally? Or if it hasn't done a lot on that in the past, what are the prospects for doing that? What's the asset base? What's the size of the alumni community? What are the business partnerships like? I'd be looking at the research base, because it's a research-intensive university. I'd be asking, what are the prospects for commercialization? Is there any kind of record with taking these great new ideas that are generated and translating them into things that make a difference? Might be new drugs, might be new products, might be new ways of doing things. Is that history and heritage there? If it's not, is the culture likely to be one that would be receptive to that? Because that's going to have to be more important. So that'd be the first thing I would look at. Resources and sustainability. Secondly, digital technology in the core business. I think it was Graham Wood that coined this really nice phrase that change has never happened this fast before, and it will never be this slow again, in reflecting on technological change. And when I think about digital transformation, it's kind of hard in some respects to know where to begin. Because as a university leader, one obvious area to begin is business systems, right? But in a sense, that's the easy bit. And I don't mean that it's easy. We've just spent 2 to 3 years working on an end-to-end business transformation program. And of course, in my university, everybody wanted new technology. They all wanted new systems. But of course, we can still bring in this new technology, bring in these new systems, and still do things the way we've always done them, can't we? It's difficult, but in a sense, it's at the easy end of it. The much more interesting things I'd be focused on in this university is thinking about the core and thinking about education in particular. What progress has been made with technology-enabled learning? And I don't mean by that, have you got a couple of MOOCs? What progress has been made in genuinely embedding blended learning of one form or another? And what's the appetite for taking that forward? How deep does it go within the organization? And then I think I'd be asking some questions about looking a bit further forward, and I'm not talking about decades here, looking a bit further forward and thinking about the impact of artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation on the world of work and its impact on job turnover. Is this an institution that's ready for some kind of transformation of learning, and I generalize, which is continuous, which is place-based, to a regime, a world where learning may be part-time, it may be discontinuous, it may be dispersed. Because it may well be, if you're changing your job every 3, 4, 5 years, that you want to do a bunch of credits in year one in place one. You want to go back to work, you want to do another bunch of credits in year two, in place two, and so on. So is there evidence of real agility and adaptability for what I think is likely to come? Third challenge, globalization, and what's going to happen. What is the future of globalization? The last great wave, in some sense, came to a bit of an abrupt pause with the 2008 global financial crisis. And we're still, of course, living with some of the consequences of that, and that includes one of the contributors to the so-called rise of populism, this anger at the fruits of the long boom in the lead up to the global financial crisis being effectively privatized and the costs being effectively socialized. And that's driven, I think, some of the rise in populism that we've seen. But are we therefore on the verge of a period of, and it's an ugly word, but a period of deglobalization? And this happened before. It happened in the 1930s, where you saw a really significant retrenchment. Are we on the verge of that? I don't think so. I mean, I hear what Simon says earlier about the kind of changing nature of industrial organization internationally, but the reality is an awful lot of global supply chains are unpickable. And for my year one students recently, just to make the point, I gave them an example of Boeing. So the Boeing 707 in the late 1950s had about 88% by value manufactured in a particular part of the United States, 12% outsourced. The 777, it's exactly the reverse of that, more or less. It's going to be awfully difficult to unpick a lot of those global supply chains. And it's also the case that in our business, as it were, you know, technology is only making international collaboration easier. We're effectively in the world without borders and without time zones. So I do see globalization continuing in our business, growth in international students. OECD is predicting that will double over the period through to 2025, growth in research collaboration. So my questions then for this university are, what's the current mapping of international partnerships? Is there any history of building win-win partnerships? What's the current track record with international students? Is it involved in networks? If not, what do we have to offer through our asset base to be part of these important international networks? So those three, I think, would be, in some sense, institution-specific issues. The fourth one, I'll touch on very briefly because both Ian and Nicola covered it off to one level or another, and that's the public perception, public goods issue. Once upon a time, it was quite hard to get higher education on the front page of a newspaper. That's much less difficult these days. as we say even today. And of course that, I think, is a direct consequence of increased participation. A generation ago, when less than 10% of the 18 to 24-year-old cohort went to universities in this country, it was somewhat under the radar screen. When it's 40% plus, as we saw in the most recent UK general election, these people matter to politicians. So we're beginning to see a debate that at one level is unhelpful, you know, and a little bit mad at times, actually, when you look at the focus of some of the dialogues in this country at the moment. But at another level, it's helpful. It gives us an opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to re-articulate the importance of talent development. It gives us an opportunity to re-articulate the importance of research and its translation into things that change the world. It gives us an opportunity to re-articulate the contribution that we make to the communities in which we're embedded in. You know, in my city, in Nottingham, it would implode without the university. And that's not just because of its economic impact, it's also because of its impact on healthcare, on education, on cultural capital. And we have to get much, much better at actually articulating that over and over again and amplifying it. And it's not just about, in our world, writing ref case studies. Important as that is, it's embedding in the institution much more deeply a responsibility to recognize and celebrate and talk about the public goods that we generate. You use the word indictment, and our past efforts at building a narrative and amplifying that narrative, and I think that's fair. Thank you very much for listening. If I get any calls later today, I'll let you know.